Hi, welcome back to Crafting with Confidence. Well, as you can see, it's definitely fall here in my hometown, and I, like all crafters at this time of year, like to start thinking about Christmas. To start this table runner, I am going to use a set of pre-cut squares just to keep things simple. This pack has about 42 squares in it, so I'm going to use 40. And I'm going to start by arranging them in rows of 4 by 10, which will be the length of my table runner. And there are the 40 squares. Now the colors aren't exactly the way I want them to be arranged, so now I'm going to quickly change them a little bit so that the lights and darks are mixed up in a variety of ways. Then I'm going to sew together each group of 4 squares into short rows. I've chosen some sage green thread that I think will go nicely for this whole project. And now I'm going to start working on the first 4 sections that I want to sew together. So I'm going to take the first 2 squares and I'll flip square 2 over square 1, right sides together, and I'm going to pin the side. Whenever you're sewing in quilting, you always have 1/4 inch seams. So I'm making a 1/4 inch seam for my first 2, and then I'm going to put square 3 over top of square 2. I'll pin it and sew it. A 1/4 inch seam always, and then finally we'll do square 4 here. Now I've completed my first row, and if I flip it over, you'll see that I'll need to iron the seams. I'm going to iron them away from me. Once I've done that, I will then sew together the next 4 squares, doing the same thing as I did in the first row. And there's the second row done. When I flip this over, I am going to iron my seams towards myself, the opposite of what I did with the first row. And there are the first 2 rows. Now I'll continue on with the other rows, doing the same thing. There's row 3, and row 4, row 5, row 6, 7, 8, 9, and row 10. There are my 10 rows, and now I'm going to take row 2 and sew it on top of row 1, starting by carefully lining up the sides, and then I'm going to put some pins in the sides and sew my 1/4 inch seam. When I'm pinning this, you'll notice that you want to have your seams line up exactly. And the very last seam, you'll see that one points one way and one points the other. This is called nesting, and it's so your quilting doesn't get too bulky. And here I'm going to sew that seam, keeping in mind that all of my quilting seams are 1/4 inch, and that's to keep things from getting too bulky. Now I have my first 2 rows together, and you can see that the seams on the first row go the opposite way of the seams in the second row. The one seam in the middle, it won't really matter which way I press that seam. There's row 3 done now, and an important part of quilting is to always press as you go, both the wrong side and the right side. Pressing is super important to keep things even. So there are some more rows coming together. The project is gradually taking shape, and I'm getting quite excited about how it's turning out. Almost there. Phew, there it is. I've sewed together all 10 rows of 4, and there we have the top of the table runner. So now I need to think about, where will I go? To my stash. That's where I'll go, and I'll find some colors that I could use for the backing. I see some candidates there, some greens, maybe some browns. So I think I'll take my favorite candidates and I'm going to bring them over and I'm going to place them underneath my quilt top, and I'll see which ones I think I like the best. My eye is going to the sage green in this corner. I think I'm going to use that for the back. And the dark brown, I think I'm going to use for the edge around the quilt at the very end. So there are the 2 colors I've chosen. I think they'll go well, and of course I need quilt batting. It turns out that it's about, let's see, it looks like it's 19 inches wide and 46 inches long. So I'm going to jot that down so that when I cut the back, I'm going to make it a little bit bigger. Here I made it 23 inches wide and 50 inches long, and I'm just going to turn it with the right side down, the wrong side up, and then I'm going to cut some cotton batting that I will spread out on top of the backing. And it's really important to make this nice and smooth because we don't want to have any extra bulk, and I cut it a little smaller, and then I'm going to put my quilt top on top of that, making sure that it's nice and smooth. And you can see this is called the quilt sandwich. The really important step here is to pin, and I'm using some bent quilting pins. You need to pin together all 3 layers, and it is a bit of a chore. You have to dig right down. Each time you put a pin in, you should be able to see it through the bottom, and smooth it out as you go. So I am going to pin my way through the whole project because when I start sewing, those pins are really important to keep it together. And there we go. I've used quite a few quilting pins, but this is going to be super important. Now, a lot of beginning quilters like to quilt or sew right on the seams. This is called stitch in the ditch, and it's a great way to do your first quilt. And that's what makes the poofiness in a quilt. I'm going to sew mine on a diagonal because I think that looks quite nice, and it's also easy to do. So I will plan on quilting my project on the diagonal. As you can see, I'm planning on doing the diagonal, and I like to start in the middle and work my way out so that things don't bunch together. And here I am starting to quilt on the diagonal. You could draw your line on first if you wanted to, but I don't find I really need to because my squares aren't that big. When you're doing this stage, you'll notice that your quilt really bunches up in your sewing machine, and so you're always having to smooth it out and make sure that it stays nice and straight. This is the reason some people like long arm sewing machines. There it is, it's all quilted. That probably took me about an hour and a half, and on the back you can see there's that quilted look in the project. Now I'm going to cut the edge so that I have just my project and not all the extra stuff on the side. We needed that extra side while we were sewing, but now I'm going to trim it right down. And there's the quilt top. It still has the pins in it. So my next job, obviously, is to take out the pins. As you can see, there's a nice quilted look to this project on both sides. Quite a few pins I had to take out of there. And now I'm going to start organizing it and cutting the brown that I'm going to have for the edge. So I do need to use my quilting mat and my roller in order to cut 2-inch strips of this fabric. I'm cutting through 2 layers. I have to press really hard and be super careful, and I'm using the quilting mat because it's very accurate. I'm going to cut 4 of these strips because that's the length I need to make my edge. And once I've cut the 4, I'm just going to trim off the very end bits because I don't need those, and I want it to be nice and straight on the end. Now I'm going to sew with right sides together these strips into one great big long strip. Once I've sewn together my 4 pieces, I'm going to iron each seam carefully, and then I'm going to double it over and with right sides out and iron the whole long strip. There it is. The next part is kind of exciting because it is the last part. I'm going to take my long strip, the double edge will go to the outside and I'll have the folded edge to the inside. And I'm going to pin this on carefully. It's quite thick, so it takes a while. And now I'm going to sew my 1/4 inch seam, leaving an opening at the end because I'll need that for later. So here I go sewing my 1/4 inch seam. I can't really sew that fast. Now when I get to the end, I am going to stop when I'm 1/4 inch from the corner of my project. When I get there, I'm going to back up a few back stitches, and then I'm going to clip my thread, and I'm going to pivot my project at this point. I still have the edge attached. Now I'm going to make a 45-degree fold in the edge, and you'll see there's a 45-degree fold, folding it away from my project and then down again. So you'll see it's kind of like making a nice little corner there where everything evens up. And now I'm going to sew, and I've made it all the way around in no time at all. And here I'm coming to the end again, and you'll see the part that I started with is right there. And here's the part that I'm ending with. The part that I started with, I did create a little seam at the end, and I'm going to sew until I'm close to that part, leaving an opening and back stitching. And now you'll see I'm going to create an overlap and cut the edging, and then I can tuck it in the first part and sew right along the edge. So I've tucked in the first part, the second part tucks right in, and off I go sewing through that. And now I have sewn the edge on. It's getting close. My next job is one of my favorite jobs, and that is hand sewing the edge on. But first I'm going to clip the corners so I can get rid of a little bit of bulk. And now I get to sit in my favorite chair and hand sew the edge on. I'm using a brown thread so it doesn't show. And just enjoying myself in my easy chair in the evening. When I get to the corner, you'll notice that it ends up folding over quite nicely, kind of like the hospital corner in a bed. So I'm going to fold it over, and I'm going to stitch it a few times to keep it in place. And then I'm going to pivot my project and continue sewing along the next side. There we go. And there's the finished project on the dining room table. I can add a poinsettia if I want to make it look even more Christmassy. And I'm feeling really good about how this turned out. In fact, I think I'll ask my husband to join me for a cup of coffee here. Thanks for joining me in making this quilted Christmas table runner. And remember, keep crafting with confidence.